All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something that seems super simple, but is actually pretty complex. We're talking about preference. I mean, we all have them, what we like more, what we like less. But as we'll see, there's a whole lot more to it, especially from a philosophical point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And for you, our listener, the learner, we know you like to get to the bottom of things. That's what we're doing today, a real deep dive into how philosophers think about preference. Not just, I like this ice cream flavor, but the whole structure of how we compare and value things. And a heads up, philosophers can't agree on a single definition of preference, so there's some really interesting debates we'll get into.
Right, so it's not just about ice cream. No, maybe a little.
Yeah.
But we are using a specific source to guide us, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on preferences.
Yeah. It's a great resource, super detailed and thorough.
And our goal today is to really pull out the core philosophical ideas about preference and some of the big arguments and disagreements that philosophers have about it. So less about predicting what people will buy and more about the fundamental question. What does it even mean to prefer something? Ready to get philosophical?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What are we even talking about when we talk about preference in this philosophical sense?
Well, in philosophy, it's usually about what we call subjective comparative evaluation. It sounds a bit jargony, but it really gets at the core of it. When a philosopher says preference, they usually mean something like agent A prefers X to Y.
So there's someone, or maybe a group, an agent, who's doing the preferring, and they're comparing two things, X and Y, and deciding one is better in some way.
Exactly. And it's important to note that this isn't just about stating a fact, like the sky is blue. It's about values. It's saying, I value X more than Y, or X is better than Y for me. And that leads us to the three key characteristics of philosophical preference. First, it's evaluative.
Right, so it's not a neutral observation. It's a judgment about what's better or worse, what's more important.
hmm
And this leads to practical reasoning, like if I prefer X to Y, then maybe I should choose X or try to bring about X.
Yeah, precisely. It's about what we should do or what outcome is more desirable. The second key element is that it's subjective. This isn't some objective ranking that exists out there in the world, independent of anyone. It's an evaluation made by an agent, a person, or a group.
Right, so it's not like saying, this mountain is taller than that building. That's a fact, you can measure it. But preference is always tied to the person or group making the judgment.
Exactly. And the third key part is that preferences are comparative. We're not just saying X is good. We're saying X is better than Y, or I prefer X to Y. It's always a relationship between at least two things.
Okay, so it's a weighing of one thing against another. It's not just about liking something in isolation. It's about liking it more than something else.
Right. And this raises a really interesting question that the Stanford Encyclopedia entry gets into. What are these preferences even about? Are we talking about concrete stuff like I prefer this book to that movie? Or something more abstract like I prefer the idea of world peace to, I don't know, the idea of everyone having a personal jetpack?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are we comparing apples and oranges, or are we comparing different possible worlds?
That's a key distinction, and it highlights a bit of a difference between how philosophers and economists tend to think about preference. Philosophers usually think the objects of preference are propositions, statements about the world. Like, you might prefer the proposition, it'll be sunny tomorrow, and make plans to go to the beach.
Right, so you're preferring one possible future over another.
Yeah. Economists, though, often focus on preferences over bundles of goods, a certain amount of food, a certain amount of leisure time, things like that.
So philosophers are thinking about preferences over ideas or scenarios, while economists are often dealing with preferences over concrete things. But the entry points out a bit of a puzzle for economists with this bundles of goods idea. What's the catch?
Well, if preference is really about what we value, what actually matters to people isn't necessarily the goods themselves, but what those goods allow us to do. Like if I prefer a hammer to a screwdriver, it's probably because I want to build something, not just because I love the feel of a hammer in my hand. The tools are just a means to an end. The real preference is about achieving a certain outcome.
Ah, so you're not really preferring the hammer itself, you're preferring the possibility of building something with it.
Right. Economists have tried to deal with this by developing ideas like household production functions, which try to model how goods get turned into useful results. But these can get really complicated. That's why philosophers often find it simpler and more elegant to just stick with propositions as the objects of preference. It cuts out the middleman in a way.
Interesting. So philosophy leans toward preferences over possibilities, while economics often focuses on preferences over tangible things, even though those are ultimately about the results those things can produce. Now, let's talk a bit about how this whole idea of preference has developed over time. The entry mentions a pretty interesting historical journey.
Yeah, definitely. While people have obviously been thinking about choices for centuries, the real in-depth focus on preference as a concept really took off in the 20th century. Before that, especially in the social sciences, the dominant idea was hedonistic utility, the idea that people are basically driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And in that view, preference was kind of secondary. You prefer X to Y because X gives you more pleasure.
So preference was just a result of this deeper drive for pleasure.
Exactly. But then thinkers like Irving Fisher and Vilfredo Pareto started pointing out some problems with this cardinal view of utility, the idea that you could precisely measure and compare pleasure across people. Pareto argued that since we can't really measure pleasure objectively, social scientists should focus on ordinal comparisons, just ranking things in order of preference without trying to put a number on how much pleasure each one gives.
So instead of saying, I get 10 units of pleasure from X and 5 from Y, you just say, I prefer X to Y.
Right. And this was a big shift. It basically made preference the primary concept instead of pleasure.
Preference went from being a side effect to being the main event.
Exactly. And in the 1930s, economists like Hicks and Allen pushed Pareto's ordinal view even further, arguing that we should completely ditch the idea of cardinal utility to get rid of all the psychological baggage that came with it. But their version of preference still had a psychological element. They thought that people had real mental states, real preferences, not just observable behaviors.
So it was still about what's going on in our minds, but just about ranking things, not measuring pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, you had thinkers like Ramsey and later von Neumann and Morgenstern developing formal ways to represent preference strengths using utility functions. But this new utility was very different from the old pleasure-based kind. Preference was still the fundamental concept, and the utility function was just a tool to represent it mathematically.
So we're seeing this move away from pleasure as the basis, or preference as the foundation, and then towards more formal but still preference-based ways of thinking about utility.
Right. And then things get even more interesting with the rise of behaviorism.
Behaviorism.
Yeah.
That's all about focusing on observable actions, right? So how does that apply to something as internal as preference?
Well, some economists, especially Paul Samuelson, started getting really skeptical about relying on unobservable mental states like preferences. They wanted to ground economics in what you could actually see people's choices. Samuelson famously said that preference is just revealed through choice. If you consistently choose X when Y is also available, then boom, you prefer X to Y. No need to speculate about what's going on in your head.
So no more peeking inside the black box of the mind. Preference became just a pattern of choices.
Right. But this radical behaviorist view, while influential, didn't completely take over economics. With the increasing connections between economics and psychology, most people in those fields now seem to see preference as a real mental ranking, even if it's not directly observable. But philosophers are still debating whether this preference that economists talk about is really the same thing as our everyday understanding of preference, or if it's become something different, more theoretical.
So even the very definition of preference is still up for grabs in philosophy. And speaking of philosophy, the entry also talks about something called preferentialism. What's that all about?
So, as the idea of hedonistic utility started falling apart, philosophers who were into utilitarianism, the idea that the goal is to maximize happiness or well-being, started looking for new foundations for their theories. Preferentialism emerged, saying that satisfying individual preferences is the one and only thing that has intrinsic value. It's part of a broader category called welfarism, which basically says that intrinsic value has something to do with well-being, but most preferentialists would say that not all preferences are good or contribute to well-being. A lot of philosophers, like John Rawls and T.M. Scanlon, have come up with more nuanced versions of preferentialism to deal with those kinds of issues.
So instead of saying pleasure is the ultimate good, it's about fulfilling what people prefer, but with the added caveat that some preferences might not actually be good for us or for others.
Right. And along with these debates about the basic concept of preference, philosophers have also been busy exploring its logical structure through what's called preference logic.
Preference logic. That sounds like trying to apply the rigor of formal logic to something as fuzzy and subjective as what we like.
You got it. That's exactly the idea. It's about using formal tools to analyze the relationships between better than and equal in value to in terms of preference. And it actually goes way back to Aristotle. But in the 20th century, philosophers like Halden and von Wright developed more comprehensive systems of preference logic. These systems have strong connections to utility theory, game theory, and decision theory.
So it's like creating a formal language to talk about how different preferences relate to each other.
Right. And in preference logic, we usually start with two basic concepts: better, representing strict preference, and equal in value to, representing indifference. They're often symbolized with those little math symbols, or P for better and sim or I for indifferent. And what's really interesting is that while we often think about these in terms of personal desires, preference logic can also be used to talk about objective betterness or value equality, even if no one actually has those preferences.
So it's a broader framework for analyzing any kind of comparative value judgment, not just personal likes and dislikes. But when we talk about preferences, they have to be about something.
Yeah, you got it. The things we're comparing are called relata. And to keep things clear, we usually assume that each preference relation is working on a specific set of relata. And in a lot of cases, these relata are assumed to be mutually exclusive, like you can't choose both at the same time.
So if I'm deciding between vacationing in the mountains or at the beach, those are mutually exclusive options.
Exactly. And that set of possible options is often called the alternative set. And preferences over such a set are called exclusionary preferences.
Got it. So mountains or beach, but not both. Now, within this system of strict preference and indifference, are there some basic ground rules that philosophers generally agree on?
Yeah, there are four basic properties that are often seen as like the defining characteristics of strict preference and indifference. The first one is asymmetry of preference. If I prefer A to B, then I can't also prefer B to A. That's pretty straightforward.
Makes sense. You can't have it both ways.
Right. The second one is symmetry of indifference. If I'm indifferent between A and B, then it doesn't matter which one comes first. A is indifferent to B, and B is indifferent to A. The third property is reflexivity of indifference. Anything is indifferent to itself.
Yeah, that seems obvious. A can't be better than A, or worse than A.
Right. And finally, there's the incompatibility of preference and indifference. If I prefer A to B, then I can't also be indifferent between them. I can't both strongly favor one and be totally okay with either one. And logically, because of the asymmetry of preference, strict preference is irreflexive. A cannot be strictly preferred to itself.
Okay, those all seem like pretty basic and logical properties of preferences. Now, the entry also brings up something called weak preference. How does that fit in?
Weak preference basically means at least as good as, or better than, or equal to. It's often symbolized as sakurliek, or R. So A sakurli B means I either prefer A to B, or I'm indifferent between them. And interestingly, sometimes weak preference is actually taken as the most fundamental relation, and strict preference and indifference are defined in terms of weak preference.
So instead of starting with, I like this more, or I'm okay with either one, we start with, this is at least as good as that. And from there, we can figure out the stricter relationships.
Exactly. A is strictly preferred to B if A is weakly preferred to B, and B is not weakly preferred to A. And A is indifferent to B if A is weakly preferred to B and B is weakly preferred to A. So strict preference is like the stricter part of weak preference, and indifference is the symmetric part.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So at least as good as Aegir becomes our starting point. The entry also mentions some shortcuts, like contracted chains and the ancestral symbol. Those are just for convenience, right, when we're dealing with a bunch of preferences in a row.
Yeah, exactly. Like A sakurli FC just means that A is weakly preferred to B and B is weakly preferred to C. And the ancestral symbol is used when we're talking about a chain of preferences. So A could mean that A is directly preferred to C, or that there's a whole series of things in between, like B1, B2, B3, and so on, where A is preferred to B1, B1 is preferred to B2, and so on until we get to C.
Okay, so it's like saying that A is ultimately preferred to C, even if it takes a few steps to get there.
Right. Now let's get into some of the really important and often debated properties of preferences. And the first one is completeness.
Completeness. What does that even mean in this context?
Well, completeness, sometimes called connectedness, basically means that for any two options, A and B, I can always make a judgment about their relative value. I either prefer one to the other or I'm indifferent between them. There's also a slightly weaker version called weak connectivity, which just says that if A and B are different, then I either weakly prefer one to the other. Completeness is true if and only if both weak connectivity and reflexivity of indifference are true.
So completeness is the idea that I can always compare any two options and decide which one I like more, or if I like them equally. But isn't that a pretty strong assumption? I mean, do we really always have a preference?
That's a good point. And a lot of philosophers and economists have argued about this. Completeness is definitely a standard assumption in a lot of economic models, like Bayesian decision theory, which assumes that people have a complete and stable ranking of all their choices. But in real life, we don't always, and maybe don't even need to, have complete preferences. Like, if I already know I strongly prefer option A to everything else, do I really need to figure out exactly how I rank all the other options I don't like as much?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if I see a movie I've been dying to watch, I might not even bother comparing it to all the other movies that are playing.
Exactly. And the entry talks about three main types of incompleteness. The first one is called uniquely resolvable incompleteness. This is where it feels like there is a single underlying complete preference, but we just don't have all the information or haven't thought about it hard enough to figure it out.
So it's like the answer is out there, we just haven't found it yet.
Right. Like, maybe I'm not sure if I prefer dark chocolate to milk chocolate, but if I did a bunch of taste tests, I could probably figure out my true preference.
Yeah, makes sense. What's the next type of incompleteness?
The second type is called multiply resolvable incompleteness. This is where it's genuinely open-ended how the preference relation would be extended. There's no single correct way to complete it. Different ways of filling in the gaps are equally valid.
So it's not just a lack of information, it's that there isn't a pre-existing complete ordering in our minds.
Exactly. And then the third type is irresolvable incompleteness. This is where things get really interesting. This usually happens when we're comparing things that are so different, it's hard to even put them on the same scale of value. Like, that entry gives some really tough examples. Choosing between the death of two acquaintances versus the death of a close friend, or the destruction of the pyramids versus the extinction of pandas, or environmental damage compared to monetary loss. These are all things that are hard to compare directly, and it might even feel wrong to try to rank them.
Yeah, those are some tough ones. It's like, how do you even begin to weigh those against each other? And this seems related to the idea of incommensurability, right? Where two things are just so different, they can't be measured by the same standard.
Absolutely. Incommensurability and irresolvable incompleteness often go hand in hand. And this kind of incompleteness comes up a lot in discussions of moral dilemmas where there might not be a clear-cut best option.
Right, because the different values at play might be incommensurable. Okay, so completeness is a pretty big assumption, and it's not always clear that it holds up in real life. Now let's talk about another key property, transitivity. We hear this one a lot, especially in economics. What's the deal with transitivity?
Transitivity basically means that if I prefer A to B and I prefer B to C, then I must also prefer A to C. It's like a consistency rule for preferences. There are similar transitivity properties for indifference. If A is indifferent to B and B is indifferent to C, then A is indifferent to C, and for strict preference. And a weak preference relation is called quasi-transitive if only its strict part is transitive.
That seems pretty intuitive. If I like hiking more than biking, and I like biking more than swimming, then it seems like I should like hiking more than swimming too.
It does seem intuitive. But, transitivity is actually a really controversial topic, and philosophers have come up with a bunch of examples that suggest it might not always hold, at least not in our actual preferences. The entry talks about the Sorites paradox. It's often illustrated with cups of coffee. Imagine you have a cup of coffee with no sugar, and then another cup with a tiny bit of sugar, so tiny you can barely tell the difference. You might be indifferent between those two. But then if you keep adding tiny amounts of sugar, eventually you'll have a cup that's super sweet, and you'll definitely prefer the no sugar cup to that one.
Ah, so each individual step is so small, you don't notice a change in preference. But across a bunch of steps, you end up with a clear preference.
Exactly. And that seems to violate the transitivity of indifference because you're indifferent between each neighboring cup, but not between the first and the last.
It's like a slippery slope for our taste buds.
Right. The entry also mentions a thought experiment by Quinn called the self-torturer. The idea is that you get paid a ton of money to endure tiny increases in pain each week. The increases are so small you barely notice them, but eventually the pain adds up and you end up in a lot of pain, even though each individual step was barely noticeable.
Yikes. So you end up in a state you clearly wouldn't have chosen initially, even though each step along the way seemed okay.
Right. And there are also examples challenging the transitivity of strict preference. The entry describes one with boxes of Christmas ornaments, where you end up with a preference cycle because different features become important depending on which two boxes you're comparing.
So even if each individual comparison seems rational, when you look at the whole set, you end up with a weird loop. And that's actually structurally similar to something called Condorcet's paradox in voting theory, where you can have a majority prefer A to B, B to C, and C to A.
Exactly. And all of these examples raise a really fundamental question. Do rational agents, like the ideal decision makers that we model in economics and philosophy, always have to have transitive preferences, even if real people sometimes seem to violate transitivity?
Yeah, good question.
There is a strong tradition, especially in economics, that says that complete transitivity of weak preference is basically a requirement for rationality.
And the big argument for that is the money pump argument, right?
Right. The idea, going back to Ramsey, is that if your preferences are cyclic, someone could theoretically exploit you and take all your money. The classic example is a stamp collector who prefers stamp A to B, B to C, and C to A. You could get them to pay a little to trade C for B, then pay a little more to trade B for A, and then pay again to trade A back for C. So they end up with the same stamp they started with, but less money. And theoretically, you could just keep doing that forever.
So if you don't have transitive preferences, you're basically a walking ATM for anyone who figures out your weird preference cycle.
That's the idea. But the entry also points out that the money pump argument depends on some assumptions that might not always be true in real life. Like, you have to be able to combine the thing you prefer with something else, like money. And you have to be willing to pay something for each trade, even if it's a tiny amount.
Okay, so the money pump argument isn't airtight. But there are also philosophical arguments for transitivity that aren't just about practical stuff like money, right? Like, Davidson argued that transitivity is so basic, it's practically part of what we mean by preference. He compared it to the transitivity of length.
Yeah, Davidson said that if preferred to isn't transitive, then the whole idea of using numbers to represent preferences breaks down. And another argument connects transitivity to the idea that preferences should guide our choices. If my preferences are all over the place, how do I even decide what to choose? Any choice could lead me to prefer something else I could have chosen instead.
But then couldn't you argue that we can have preferences about things that we can't choose? Like, I might prefer that a certain team wins the Super Bowl, but I can't actually control that.
Yeah, and you could also say that indifference doesn't really guide choices, because if I'm indifferent between two things, it doesn't matter which one I choose. But I don't think anyone would say that being indifferent between things is irrational.
So transitivity is definitely a complex issue with strong arguments on both sides.
Okay.
Moving on, the entry includes this whole table called an order typology. It basically categorizes different types of preference relations based on which logical properties they satisfy. Like, is it reflexive? Is it transitive? Is it complete? What's the point of all that?
That table is like a map of the different logical shapes that our preferences can take. You have things like preorders, partial orders, total preorders, which are also called weak orderings, and linear orderings, also called chains. And the important thing is that the specific combination of properties a preference relation has really matters. It affects how we can represent it mathematically and how it behaves in models of decision making. For example, having a total preorder, a relation that is reflexive, transitive, and complete, is often considered a requirement for being able to represent preferences using a nice, clean utility function.
So it's like a taxonomy for understanding the underlying logic of different kinds of preferences.
Right. Now, so far, we've mostly been talking about exclusionary preferences, preferences between things that can't both be true at the same time. But the entry also gets into something called combinative preferences. What are those?
Combinative preferences?
Yeah.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, combinative preferences are about situations where the things we're comparing can both be true. Remember our earlier example about preferring a dog to a cat? That kind of ignores the possibility of having both. The meaning of a statement like, I prefer a dog to a cat, can actually be pretty ambiguous. Does it mean I prefer having a dog and no cat to having a cat and no dog? Or if I already have a cat, would I prefer getting a dog too? Or if I already have a dog, would I prefer to keep just the dog rather than also getting a cat?
Ah, so it's about preferences over combinations of things, not just individual things.
Exactly. And in these cases, the things we're comparing are usually states of affairs, often represented as sentences or propositions. And typically, we assume that if two sentences mean the same thing logically, we can substitute one for the other in a preference statement without changing the preference itself. Properties like completeness and transitivity that we talked about earlier can be extended from exclusionary preferences to combinative preferences. But there are also some logical properties that are specific to combinative preferences, like disjunctive interpolation or contraposition of weak preference. Some of these are pretty straightforward, but others are more complex and controversial.
Okay, so combinative preferences add another layer of complexity. How do these relate to the more basic exclusionary preferences, though?
Well, one way to think about it is that combinative preferences can often be understood as arising from more basic exclusionary preferences that are defined over possible worlds. A possible world is basically a complete description of how everything could be. So my preference for having a dog might actually be a preference for all the possible worlds where I have a dog, regardless of whether I also have a cat or a goldfish or anything else, compared to all the possible worlds where I don't have a dog.
So it's like a shorthand. Instead of listing out every possible combination, I just say, I prefer having a dog. And that implicitly means I prefer all the possible worlds where that's true.
Exactly. But some philosophers and economists think it's more realistic to focus on smaller sets of alternatives, just the ones that are relevant to the specific decision at hand. That reflects the idea of bounded rationality, that we don't have the mental capacity to consider every possible option.
Makes sense. We're not always thinking about every possible scenario when we make a decision. Okay, the entry also gets into something called preference-based monadic value predicates. What are those?
Those are basically ways of defining words like good and bad in terms of the preference relation. It's like asking, can we build our concept of good out of our understanding of better than?
So instead of just saying, this is good, can we define good by saying something like, this is preferred to something else?
Exactly. And the entry talks about two main ways to do this. The first one is called the negation-related definition. It was proposed by Brogan, and it says that something is good if it's preferred to its negation. So P is good if and only if P is preferred to not P. And bad is defined the opposite way. Something is bad if its negation is preferred to it.
So something is good if I prefer it to not having it, and bad if I prefer not having it to having it. Pretty neat way to think about it.
Right. The second approach is called the indifference-related definition. This one was developed by Chisholm and Sosa, and it uses the idea of neutral propositions. A proposition is neutral if it's neither preferred to nor dispreferred to its negation. And then something is good if it's preferred to some neutral proposition, and bad if some neutral proposition is preferred to it.
So we're basically setting a baseline of indifference, and then saying that good is anything better than that, and bad is anything worse than that.
Exactly. And the entry points out that these two types of definitions don't always give you the same results. They were mostly developed assuming completeness of preferences, though there are formal models that don't require that. And some philosophers have tried to go the other way, trying to define preference in terms of good and bad instead.
It's like a philosophical chicken and egg problem. Which comes first, preference or goodness? Can we define one in terms of the other?
Yeah, and the entry discusses some of those attempts, but it can get pretty complicated.
This whole discussion has really shown how much depth there is to the concept of preference. Now, in our last segment, let's talk about how we can represent preferences using numbers. Can we quantify something as subjective as preference?
We can try. That's where utility functions come in. The basic idea is to assign a number to each alternative, so that A is preferred to B if and only if the number for A is bigger than the number for B, and A is indifferent to B if the numbers are equal. This is a really important tool in economics for modeling how people make decisions when there are limited resources. But it's important to remember that utility functions aren't perfect. Not all preferences can be represented this way, and there are different kinds of utility functions that make different assumptions. And this modern idea of utility is very different from the old idea of utility as pleasure, which has been criticized a lot.
So it's a useful tool, but it's not a complete or flawless representation of preference. And the entry talks about ordinal and cardinal representations. What's the difference?
Ordinal representation is the simplest kind. It just captures the order of preferences. A is preferred to B if and only if the utility of A is greater than the utility of B. The actual numbers themselves don't really matter as long as they reflect the order. You can do all sorts of mathematical transformations to the utility function, and as long as you preserve the order, the underlying preferences stay the same. A preference relation has an ordinal representation if and only if it satisfies completeness and transitivity. There are some exceptions, though, when you have infinitely many alternatives.
So ordinal utility is just about the ranking, not about how much more you prefer one thing to another.
Exactly. Cardinal representation, on the other hand, tries to capture information about the intensity of preferences. Like how much more do you prefer A to B compared to how much you prefer C to B? This requires a measurement scale that can represent differences or even ratios between preference strengths. And there are different kinds of cardinal scales, interval scales, which let you compare differences, and ratio scales, which let you compare ratios.
So cardinal utility tries to get at the how much more of a preference. And the entry mentions that a lot of work in this area uses lotteries to try to figure out these preference intensities.
Yeah, the idea is that by looking at how people choose between lotteries with different outcomes and probabilities, we can get a sense of how much they value different things. The work of Ramsey, von Neumann, and Morgenstern, Savage, and Jeffrey has been super important in developing these approaches, though their specific frameworks are pretty different.
So it's like using our willingness to gamble to reveal how strongly we feel about different outcomes.
Right. And then there are some other more nuanced approaches to utility representation, like just noticeable difference, J&D representation, which says that we only have a strict preference if the difference in utility is bigger than some threshold. And interval representation, which assigns a range of possible utility values to each alternative. These are all attempts to create more realistic models of preference, taking into account the limitations of our perception and judgment.
It's amazing how much complexity is packed into this seemingly simple idea of preference. We've gone from the very basics of defining it to exploring its logical properties, different types, connections to values, and even ways to represent it mathematically.
And for you, the learner,